everyone. Welcome back to The Whole Picture, where we chat with your favorite entrepreneurs about their hobbies, passions, and deep interests. Today, we are here with Andrea Befus, who is a Airbnb strategist and helps owners make more money. She has 19 co-host properties. She helps these Airbnb hosts focus on the tasks that help them grow their properties and their portfolio. So that is an amazing thing. Welcome, Andrea. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here today.
So we were chatting a little bit just before we hit record here, and you have this beautiful wall art behind you that is a map. And that's something that I know about you. I would love to get into is that you have this immense travel background, and this spans way beyond your involvement in Airbnb and travel. So I'm curious, looking at this map, how many countries have you lived in?
I have lived in one, two, I've lived in 4 countries and 3 continents.
3 continents. That's
Yeah.
amazing. And so this was like a big part of your childhood, right?
Yeah, we would move every few years. And when we were international, we learned that, wow, everything in Europe is really close to everything else. And so because the international school we went to, it had an interesting schedule where they didn't have a typical summer break like they do in America. They would have more frequent breaks throughout the year. And so if there was a break, then instead of going downtown to Istanbul, because we were living in Turkey, we would hop on a plane and go to Egypt because it was only 45 minutes. And so my parents really prioritized us having unique cultural experiences, especially while we were living overseas in places where it was a lot easier and cheaper to travel because we were already so close.
Yeah. So what was that like for you? Because that would just kind of be your normal thing,
Yeah.
right? So like when you were talking to other people and realizing like, oh, they're going on vacation like, 2 hours down the road to, somewhere that's not Egypt and so cool like that. Um, were you like realizing, I'm excited that I had all those opportunities, or like how was that for you?
It was really interesting growing up with this because this is a really good question. I remember the younger I was, the more I actually didn't like it because every place I would move, I would meet people in class or I'd make new friends and they would say, "Oh, this is my best friend," not talking about me. And I would think, "Oh my gosh, I don't have a best friend. Like, I've never lived in a place long enough to have a best friend." And so when I was younger, I realized that what we were doing was different, and I was a little bit, I don't want to say sad, but I felt like I was missing out on people that stayed in one place long enough to kind of have roots. But as I got older, it was really interesting this shift that happened. It was probably around 14, 15, 16-ish. Those were my peak awkward middle school years that happened to be off the continent, which I say is a huge blessing because no one here in America saw my peak awkwardness. Um, but I remember speaking about Egypt, funny enough, for one of our breaks, we flew to Egypt. And I remember this amazing experience where we like bribed our way into the Great Pyramids because they ran out of tickets, but we kind of like slipped a bill to the security guard and he let us go into the tomb. And so it was this amazing experience. And flash forward a few years later, I'm sitting back in America, I'm in high school, and we're talking about ancient Egypt in our history class. And I remember sitting there in the desk looking at these photos of the pyramids and thinking, oh my gosh, I've been in there. How cool is that? And as I'm having those thoughts, someone in my class just blurted out, Egypt sounds weird. Like, that's so gross, or that's weird. And I had the first moment where I thought, whoa, okay, I have a really different perspective on the world here. And honestly, nothing against my classmate because they just didn't know. Like they hadn't been there. They haven't experienced as much as I had. Not that I'm better than them, but they literally didn't have the experience of what it means to travel. And so from younger, it was a lot of mixed emotions, but as I got older, and especially now, I am 100% grateful that that's the environment that I grew up in, that we really prioritized seeing lots of people, places, cultures, foods, new experiences, but especially adaptability and problem solving. There's a lot of that in not only living overseas, but traveling as much as we did.
Did your parents, were they doing that intentionally, do you think? Like, were they trying to foster those those values in you guys, like where you were getting that perspective and all of that, or was that kind of like a byproduct of something that was happening on their end that was causing all the trouble?
I think they were doing it really intentionally. They knew that it was a really unique opportunity and a blessing that we could travel as much as we did because we had mileage. We weren't loaded or really wealthy growing up, but we had hotel points and frequent flyer miles where we would have these really unique experiences. And I remember growing up, they would say things like, we have the opportunity now, so let's take advantage of it because you never know what's going to happen in life. You might get married and maybe your husband won't like travel. I mean, that didn't happen to my sister or I, but, or maybe you'll have a kid with a physical disability and it'll be hard to travel. So their thought process was, we have the opportunity now, let's take advantage of it, and we know it'll be helpful along the way.
So they very much had that like seize the moment kind of
Yes.
mentality. Is that something that you find yourself like to this day still using even outside of like travel, just in general, as you're moving through life?
Yes, to a fault sometimes. Just last week, I said no to something that I probably my default was to say yes to, but then overwhelm myself. My church, our local church here, they were asking for volunteers to help go on this trek this summer and to do this multi 12, 15 mile plus in the woods hike essentially with youth from our church, and they were asking for volunteers, and I said like I'll volunteer. I'm like, tell me more info, and then we got the info back, and the more we thought about it, the more we thought, okay, wait, you know what, actually, like I don't know if this is going to work with our schedule, and right now I'm going through physical therapy with my knees and hips, and so that seize the moment. My default is always yes, but I'm actually learning right now. I'm developing the skill that sometimes you don't have to say yes and you don't have to seize all the moments. So that's something I'm working through right now, even.
That's so interesting because I think that we kind of, all of us have a tendency, like a default. Either our default is yes or our default is
Yeah.
no. And I have found my default, like I come from a background of very like high anxiety. So like my default is like almost always no. And then I'll convince myself. And it's
Yep.
always right. Like every time I do it, I'm like, oh, that was so much fun. But and like, so it's like we all are kind of finding this like balance between, these two things.
Yeah.
Um, that's so cool. So you're traveling around, and at what point in your life did you kind of like stop doing the traveling around? Like you mentioned, you were in that class in the States then. So like at what age range is that?
Yeah, so the longest place I lived somewhere was 4 years, and it was for high school. Once I hit freshman year of high school, my parents said, okay, let's settle down so they can have at least graduate all through the same high school. So they were there for about 6 years. And and then pretty much since I graduated high school, I've kept up the traveling. I went to college for a year and then I served a service mission for a year and a half. And I was in Albania for that time, learned how to speak Albanian, lived there like full into the culture, everything. And then came back, got married about a year later. And then my husband and I have been married for 7 years and we have moved 7 times, all within Utah. Right now we're in Kentucky, but we just love being on the move. Both of us like new environments that push us to take different action. We hate waiting. We don't like just sitting around doing the same thing over and over again. We really value growth, and we've found that moving around does help that.
That is so amazing that you guys connected on that. Was that like an intentional, like as you
No,
were, no? Okay.
definitely not. Because when I got married, I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to settle down. We're going to have one house and just be somewhere. And we actually did that for 2.5 years, and I got so bored. I was so bored. Like, okay, we have to move.
Yeah. That is, I've similar. I lived in one house my whole life, and then once I hit like 19, I moved every year for, like a 10-year period of my
Wow.
life. Like I was all over. I'm curious, was that like your desire to have the one house? Like you went into, marriage being like, we're gonna have one house and do it. Was that like out of kind of, I just wanted to have an opposite experience in life, or did you want your kids to have like a different experience, or like what was that kind of desire coming from?
It's a great question. I think it was, I just wanted to try something different. It wasn't an anti what I had in childhood. It's just staying in one place sounded like the adventure to me because adventure the normal was kind of the typical adventure of traveling a lot. So for me, the adventure was staying in one place. And it could have been just the city we were in or the environment wasn't right. I think one day we will, I don't know, I say this every year, but maybe one day we'll settle down more. But so far it's working, the moving around.
That's so cool. So you have a daughter now,
Yep.
and she is how old?
She's almost a year and a half.
And she's already a world traveler, right? She's already gone a few places.
Yeah, she's been to Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, France, I think, and then Switzerland.
And did that give you a different perspective? Like, because you traveling is normal for you, but
Yeah.
traveling as a parent is
Oh my
now
gosh, yeah.
like you're in a different spot. You're kind of more relating maybe to your parents now from that.
Yes. There's so much more logistics to travel once you have other little human beings. I don't know how my mom did it because I was born in Tokyo and so was my sister in Japan. And so she would fly from Japan to America with me when I was younger, and then me and my sister. Like I legitimately don't know how she did it. And yeah, so traveling with Charlotte now, it's finding this balance between logistically, how do we do this? Like getting all the right gear or saying just like screw it and just figuring it out along the way. There's definitely an element of that. So it's this balance of traveling with her, making it work, but also not pushing myself too hard. Well, when we were in Belgium, we traveled when she was 7 weeks old. We had to get the permission from the doctor and everything because it was a little early. I didn't know that. We booked the flights, and I'm like, this will probably be fine. Turns out it's a little risky because it was like we had to get her shots early. I don't know. And so we traveled when she was 7 weeks old, and my husband ended up not making the flight because of a passport issue. So it was just me and the baby, and then my in-laws were on the plane, which was super helpful because so I could go to the bathroom and stuff. But once we got there to Belgium, we were a few days in, we're having a great time. I've learned you have to do a lot less with a kid. Growing up, we would kind of wake up at 6 a.m., go to bed at 8 p.m., like go, go, go all day. You can't do that with a baby. It was essentially just one excursion a day. But there was one really actually character building experience where we had planned a day trip to Germany from Belgium, and it was going to be a pretty long drive, a few hours in Germany, stay the night, and then come back. And at that time, Charlotte hated the car. Like she didn't like her car seat. She would just scream and scream after 30 minutes, and this was going to be many hours in the car. And so, thinking about doing this, my seize the day go getter, like, yes, let's do this, that came in direct conflict with reality of I actually don't think anybody is going to like this. I don't think I'm going to like it. Charlotte's for sure not going to like it. Everyone else in the car is not going to like it. And so I remember having a mental breakdown actually one night, the night before, thinking like, I don't know if I can do this, but I don't want to let anyone down. Because it was going to go see my husband Taggart's family heritage. They had family from like ancestry. They were going to be there. We were going to go see the cemetery and everything. And I just remember feeling really, really bad about not thinking I could go. And so I kind of like called a family powwow with everyone because it was my in-laws, my parents, the baby, my husband. And I like kind of called everyone together and I was like, I don't know if I can do this tomorrow. Actually, I don't think Charlotte's up for it. I don't know if I can do it. I don't want to put everyone else like have everyone else have a bad time. And they were so amazing. They said, first off, thank you for bringing this up. And also, you don't have to go. Like, don't make a big deal out of this. Like, we'll just go, we'll have a great time, and you can stay here and just hang out. And I was like, that sounds great. So I'm going to do that. But it was a really character building experience. It was hard for me to say no. It was one of the first times where having a kid really made me reevaluate my personal priorities and just the reality of life with a kid. Because I hate not doing things because something's hard. And so it's finding the balance between like what's hard versus like what's really not even worth it.
Yes. As you were saying that, it was making me think of like, I'm naturally an introvert, and anytime I go to an event or something, I'm always pushing myself to like go
Yeah.
to one more thing, like talk to one more person than you would normally, and that is critical. Like you have to do the thing.
Right.
But there's also a certain point where that desire is like detrimental to you because there's like a point where
Yeah.
you're like, I have been talking now for 6 hours and I don't feel well and I'm jet lagged and like
Yeah.
you can push yourself too far in the sake in that way. And so you like had that moment of like recognition, and that is just so cool to see because we all have had that,
Yeah.
and yeah, that's wonderful. So you stayed home, and that have you had that experience now a few different times, or like has that did that like shift your perspective, moving forward in traveling?
Yeah, I think in traveling, but also in life too, where more does not always equal more. Like sometimes less is more, and that's okay. Just because I'm not go, go, go all the time, it doesn't mean I'm not living up to my potential. Because that's a really core value for me is making sure I be the person that I want to be, and sometimes I equal being to doing. And so if I'm not doing something all the time, it means I'm not being who I want to be. But I've learned I have to disconnect that of I can still be who I want to be if I read a book for 30 minutes and not like go do off and do something crazy, which I tend to do.
Yes. Yeah, I think a lot of us have that experience where we're like people who end up in the entrepreneurship world in general, it's like we all struggle with, vacations and like
Yeah.
everything. I remember Russell Brunson talking one time about how his wife like has to force him to go on vacation and like relax. And it sounds bizarre to people, but like there's a mentality of just like there's so much to see, there's so much to do, there's so much to build. You've mentioned a few times your value, like this is something I value, this is something, is that something that you spent a lot of time like understanding about yourself, or was that like part of your upbringing of like knowing what your personal values are and how they come into play in your world?
Wow, I have not thought about that. Um, I think values were instilled in me as a kid through my family, through religion, just having values. And I think as I've grown up and been more on my own, I've had to be intentional about recognizing what those values are and how they apply to what I'm doing. Because I can value something but not understand how it's actually applicable into the day to day. And so I think it's a combination of both things.
Yeah, I think it's so important, especially as people who, we have businesses and we're coming into contact with other people, and like when we know you have it seems like you have such a strong grasp of like yourself, and also a self-awareness of like I'm someone who likes to do this, I'm someone who
Mhm.
doesn't like to, you said earlier, not do something just because it's hard. And
Yeah.
so that's something, traveling, as much as it is so cool and we have so many amazing experiences, like it's hard too.
Yeah,
Like you're
it
away
is.
from your routines, you're, squished in a middle seat for 6 hours, there's hard aspects to it.
Yeah.
So something else that has made me think of is I've seen before that you've done like um Tough Mudder experiences in marathons and all that. Was the initial draw to that mentality of I do things that are difficult, or was there something else that kind of started that journey for you?
Yeah, so for some context, growing up, I was on all of the sports teams, but not good. I wasn't, I was 6 feet tall or 5'10" in high school, so super tall and lanky, and I could hold a ball. And so all the schools I went to were like, hey, join our team. And so I just did a lot of sports. I did soccer, volleyball, softball, basketball. I tried them all. And the one I was maybe good at was softball. But that's because there was no running involved, because I hated running. Like, I cannot emphasize enough how much I hated running. And so that's probably why I liked it the most. And when we got back to America, sports is a whole different world. Everyone was way better than what I had experienced. And so when I joined the freshman basketball team, it was way more intense. Everyone else was really, really good. I was just average, and it just wasn't fun anymore. And so I did one season of that and then I stopped. And then after that, I focused pretty much on academics because the college I wanted to get into was really hard to get into. And so I'm like, okay, I checked the box on the sports freshman year, but I'm actually going to focus on these other things. And so I kind of took a break. But funny enough, my parents, they're amazing. I went to them one day and I wanted a smartphone. So I said, hey, mom, hey, dad, can I have a smartphone? And they said, sure, let me talk with or I can't remember who I asked, might have been my dad. And he said, let me talk with your mom and I'll get back to you. They do this all the time. It's great. They like consult and then come up with decisions later. And I remember he comes back to me the next day and he said, okay, so you said you wanted a new phone. Here's what we're going to do. We're not just going to hand you one. You're going to work for it. And so we're going to do 8 obstacle races as a family. We're going to train together. We're going to do them. We're going to complete them. At the end, you have to choose some sort of finale event, and then you can get your phone. And I remember thinking as a teenager, like, are you kidding me? Like, can I please just have a phone so I don't have this Nokia brick phone that is so hard to text on? But I remember even then, though, I remember thinking like, okay, this makes sense. My parents have never handed me anything in my life. And so we go through and we do it. I did a zombie run, a color run. They were all 5Ks, and I had to like get up and I had to train. I wasn't as dedicated to it as I probably could have, but it was fun. My mom was the photographer, and so I would make little videos after because I was using my creative juices. That was fun for me. And then at the end, I chose a Go Ruck, which was the most anti-running thing that I could find that would qualify for the finale event that my dad said. My sister did a half marathon. I did a Go Ruck, which was essentially working as a team to doing these really physically demanding tasks like carrying a telephone pole through a city, doing push-ups in ice water, army crawling up a hill, all with a weighted backpack. And so I was 17, 16, 17, 18 with a bunch of these like buff army dudes and like really fit ladies. And then my dad, he did it with me. And so that was kind of the background context for my most recent athletic endeavors, I guess, is when my husband and I were living in Salt Lake City. We were at this really cool apartment complex, and they had a great gym, and I wasn't using it. And I realized that I needed something to motivate me to actually use the resources that were in front of me. And I mean, surface level, I wanted to look good. Like I wanted to look good, feel strong, but at a deeper core level, I knew I wanted to get pregnant and have a baby, and I didn't feel like my body was ready for that. And so that was kind of the deeper motivation for working out harder. But surface level, like I wanted to look good and feel good too. And that's when I realized, okay, in the past I did these 5Ks, they were pretty motivating. There was a reward at the end. That seemed to work. Maybe I'll try it again. And so that's when I signed up for 3 Spartan races. So it was the 5K, 10K maybe, that the middle one might be a little bit longer, and then the half marathon Spartans. So that's how that happened.
Wow. So your parents, you wanted a phone, and your parents said yes, but you have to do these
Yeah.
races and you have to work for it. And that one decision like changed the way that
Yeah.
you view that. And so it's so cool to me because it's now like instilled in you
Yeah.
that you have this, you can go work. There's other ways to work for something. Like that's the first thing I thought of because you said,
Oh,
my dad said
interesting.
you have to work for it. And I'm thinking, okay, they're gonna send her to like an ice cream shop to like work and pay for the phone. But this is like a life skill that they taught you instead. Like this is like
Yes.
a skill.
I had not thought about it that way, but yeah, you are totally right.
I'm so curious where that came from for them. Like what like in terms of like, okay, there's all the options in the world. Like, what are we going to, present her with? Are you the oldest or had someone
Yes.
else? Okay. So you were like the first, because I know my friends that have bigger families, it's like whatever the parent establishes with the oldest is like, okay, we have to trickle it down now. So I'm so curious where that came from for them. Like, okay, we're gonna say that it's marathons, Tough Mudders, and that kind of thing to get them the phone.
Yeah, I'm sure I have asked them that, but I can't remember. If I had to guess, they're really big on values, I guess, values and being I don't think I guess independence, but also self-reliance. And they probably saw something in me that was physically a little bit not lazy because I'm not a lazy person, but I was not as physically active. So that could have been part of it. But if I had to guess, they thought it would just be a fun family building activity. They were really big on creating memories as a family. And so I think that's probably where it really stemmed from was family memories.
Do you think that they focused so much on that because you guys were moving around a lot? So like you mentioned you didn't have a best friend for a while. Like so you guys were like kind of your own unit moving throughout the world.
Yeah, we were for sure our core unit because we would live far away from cousins, grandparents, aunts, uncles. We'd maybe go for summers or Christmas or something, but ultimately we were our core unit. And so that was the unit that traveled everywhere. And so they were really big on making sure we were always okay as a family.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So you mentioned that you were going to like you wanted to get into a college that you wanted to get into and all that. So at this point in your life, like what were you thinking that you wanted to be? What was your goal going into college?
To be honest, I had no idea. I I had no idea what I wanted to be growing up. I remember at one point I wanted to be an artist. Another point I wanted to be a firefighter. Uh, a scientist, a doctor. That one was short lived because I don't do like medical stuff. Is really scary to me. Um, but literally, I honestly had no idea until senior year of high school. We had to choose a science credit, and my two options were oceanography, and then the other one was a mapping class that was paired with our local college. And oceanography was not interesting to me at all. I'm like, I don't know how that's going to be useful to me, and I've heard there's a lot of homework, so I'm going to go do this other one. Literally, it was like an afterthought. And so senior year, I'm in this science credit and I'm learning how to use this mapping software. And I think, like, you know what, this is kind of cool. I guess I'm into maps. I've traveled and I saw the connection between human problems and data and how maps can solve problems and help people make decisions. And so I thought, like, you know what, sure. And sure enough, I looked at the college I wanted to go to and it happened to have a really good program for mapping, geographic information systems. And so I thought, you know what, I'll just choose that degree because that seems like something that makes sense. And then I'll just switch it if I want to. And then I never did.
So you went to that college, you started that program, and is it what you thought it was going to be? Like what was your experience like going into that program and into that field?
I think my teacher in high school, I think, did a really good job describing what it was because I didn't feel any bait and switch or anything once I got to college. It seemed pretty much what I expected. I don't think I quite realized the scope of how much you can help using mapping and data analytics. But overall, it was a really great transition, and I saw a lot of use cases for it. And I also saw a need for it in the market. So there were a lot of job openings. There were a lot of international job openings, which were interesting. It paid well. It was in the STEM field. I knew being a girl in science doesn't hurt, even though I don't necessarily believe in getting a job just because you're a girl. I'm like, if it works in my favor, sure.
Yeah, totally. So give me an example, like you said, use cases, and I'm like, I understand what it is, but I'm trying to like picture exactly like where it comes into play in certain ways. So like give us an example of kind of like a use case of it.
So some of the jobs I had after college, one was I was mapping the process of draining chemical waste out of international army bases. So you could measure the chemicals in the ground and make sure things weren't toxic in the earth. Another one was mapping sewer lines, mapping airports to make sure everything was up to regulations. And then other more interesting things in my mind were mapping election results. I was in charge of mapping all the data for the elections. Night of, we'd be like running back and forth with USBs of data and mapping so the public could see who was winning in which precinct. And also COVID data. I was in charge of the Emergency Operations Center for COVID and mapping the data there, helping stakeholders make decisions and making sure that people had the resources they needed. And so it was a really cool way to see how software and data can be used to make like turning complicated data into something easily understandable to someone that needs to make high stakes decisions.
Okay, yes. So when you said a lot of use cases, that is a lot because that is like very much different than what I was picturing. Like I like from election night to like COVID data and all that, like that's a big range. And so I'm curious, like as you were doing that, like that it's multiple things, even though it's all within the same field. What did that like help you? You mentioned before, like I get bored, in one
Yes.
spot.
Oh, it was very helpful.
Yeah, I can
Yep.
imagine that would be the same for me, where like you're able to kind of like I freelance now and I write, for different people. So you're able to kind of do multiple things within the same job.
Exactly. Yeah.
So as you're doing that, like you're switching, between these cases and all these things, and how long were you doing that for? Like what was your trajectory in that career?
So my plan was to stay in that career for forever and kind of climb either the government or corporate ladder, just because that's what I knew there was options for me. And so I ended up probably all in all, I was in the mapping world for 4 years, I think. And then when 2020 hit, then that's when I remember sitting in the emergency operations center. We have like all the news channels on, and I'd been in there for months, and I was just so drained of not only just having the news on all day, and it was just so emotionally draining, but I just remember like being in a cubicle and thinking, wow, I don't think I can do this. Like even with different projects, I don't think I can just sit in a cubicle all day. And I had this gut feeling that I was potentially meant for more than that, which was terrifying and exciting for me at the same time.
I can relate to that so well. I had someone right in front of me in a cubicle, one of my old jobs, and every day at 11:01 she would stand up and go get lunch every single day because that, was her routine. And I was like, if I'm in that much of a routine, like to the minute, when I am older, I will put my head through this desk. Like I could not
Yeah,
fathom
me too.
it. I find that a lot among entrepreneurs. And so when you had that moment, like what were you thinking was going to be next for you? Did you have something in mind, or were you just like, I know it's not this?
Wow, I hadn't thought about that moment before. I think I honestly don't think I knew what it was, because what happened after that is I must have Googled something, because all the ads on my social media started popping up with free webinars to learn about this and this and this. And I guess over time, it just pointed me towards the online business, digital marketing world. And so that's kind of the path that I went to. But I honestly don't think there's never in a million years could I imagine I'm in the spot where I am today. But it's so much better than I could have imagined.
Yes, I'm similar to you. So did you have then a moment like you went into the digital marketing? I fell down the same rabbit hole too. I had a sick day and my boss was like texting me like, "Are you really sick? Like 100 fever is like kind of
Oh,
borderline. Can you
man.
come in?" And I'm like, I can't do this for my whole life.
Yeah.
And I was Googling things and I got into marketers, we love them. They're great at retargeting.
They are.
So I fell into the same rabbit hole and I have a very clear moment of when I was like, I'm going to make the switch. So did you
Mm.
have that like you mentioned, that job that you had like paid well and it was what you were going to be in your whole life. So like did you have a moment of like deciding to leave and do this thing or did it happen gradually?
It was a little bit gradual. So I did some network marketing, and that wasn't my favorite. I learned a lot, but I knew that wasn't the path that I wanted to continue on. And then I also did, uh, I joined different programs. Like I joined a Facebook ads program. I joined one of Josh Forty's programs. And so I kind of entered the world and started learning who was who and practicing things out. But there was a pivotal moment though where how did I even get there? I think it was through contacts I met Katie Richardson, and so I joined one of her programs, and then I realized I might be able to actually work for her. I don't know if she's hiring or anything, but I thought like, you know what, that's the type of person that I really look up to, and she understood me and my situation, and so I remember DMing her on Instagram one day, and I'm like, I don't know if, or I might have been a client already. I can't remember. But I remember asking her, I said, I don't know if you're hiring, and this may be totally out of the blue, but I would love to work for you. And she responded and she said, you're not going to believe this, but I was literally going to make a job posting tomorrow. And so she's like, here, fill an application. And we'll see how it goes. And long story short, I worked for her after my mapping job. I would do a few hours for her every day. And then I did that for a year, and then I made the switch where I worked for her full time and then put mapping aside.
Wow. What a that just seems like so divine. Like that
Yeah,
you
I
had
think it
that
was.
instinct, and so how did your parents like were they happy about your mapping career and like were they like what are you doing or like how did that go?
They were super supportive. Yeah. I don't know if they totally understood every aspect of it, but I never got any sense of like what are you doing? They like to think through and problem solve and stuff. So my family has a culture of asking a bunch of questions, probably too much, but it's a good practice because it helps you like think through all of the different sides, like best case scenario, worst case scenario. And so I remember having a lot of discussions with them where they were just genuinely curious and excited for me and wanted to understand. But I never got any naysayer stuff. So I know a lot of people in the online business world, they say like, oh, you're gonna get arrows thrown at you and people are going to be naysayers, but I feel really blessed that I haven't had a lot of that in my experience.
That's wonderful. I'm so glad. And I also wonder if it has, because all of your upbringing, like it sounds like you were encouraged to develop like a self-awareness and like a sense of like self-trust in
Mm-hmm.
like,
Mm-hmm.
and your parents like were building trust in you too. Like, we'll do this if you do this. Like it very much like a, that transaction of like
Yeah.
trust. And so like as you're an adult and you're like, I'm gonna make this decision, like they probably know that you've already, by the time you even bring it up, you've done your research and you've done
Yeah.
your stuff.
Yeah.
Is that like now that you're a mom, like are you thinking like how you're gonna kind of do similar things with your daughter now and kids in the future? Like is that part of your thought process?
Yeah, but half of me is so excited to do it, and half of me is terrified because I think back to some of the things that I did as a teenager. When we were living in Virginia, one time my parents let us go on a day trip to New York City on the Chinatown bus with a group of friends. We went to New York City for a day and came back, and I was just like we were all just a bunch of teenagers. And part of me is like imagining little baby Charlotte go to New York City on her own. I'm like, absolutely not. But I think you're right that we had built enough trust and yeah, there was trust there where it was okay. And so I'm really excited to continue that with Charlotte. My parents were really good on creating clear expectations and working with us to problem solve and create our own consequences. I remember when I got my driver's license when I was 15 and a half, we sat down at the dinner table. A lot of discussions happened around dinner and fun memories around food. And they said, okay, you have your license now. And here are some rules that we think are important as you start driving. What rules do you think? And I remember we discussed it. And then they said, okay, if one of these gets broken, what do you think is a good consequence to have if these are broken? And I remember saying, probably not have my phone for a week or something. They said, okay, do you agree to that? And we said, yes. We probably wrote something up too that I signed. They were big on contracts and just having it all written out, which I'm a big believer in now. But I remember I broke the rule one time. I drove my friend and I didn't get his parents' verbal permission before I drove him. And that was one of the rules we had decided. And so, sure enough, like they heard about it or I told them or something. And I said, okay, well, I guess I don't have my phone for a week. And they're like, yep. And then I didn't have my phone. And then I got it back after a week. And it just, in my mind, it wasn't a big deal. Like I knew what was going to happen. I broke the rule. I saw the consequence. And I was like, okay, well, I'm mad, but there's not much I'm going to do about it.
That is so like I'm going back to trust now because there is some
Yeah.
level of like you often kids like it's like they do something and they're either scared to bring it up because they don't know what the consequence is or they don't know
Mhm.
what the reaction is going to be or it feels random to them
Right.
like
Yeah.
and so you like had that moment of like I know exactly what's going to happen and so either if you brought it up or it was found out there probably wasn't as much like fear in that experience.
No, we didn't have a lot of fear in the house growing up. Everything was really predictable, which is kind of ironic because our surroundings change so often, but internally as a family, everything was pretty predictable.
Do you think your parents did that like intentionally to create like a predictable, like, this is our family, this is how we deal with things, and it's the same no matter what continent we're on?
Yeah, I think they were really intentional at that. I think they had had experiences in the past where some experiences with their own parents was really predictable and some were not predictable. And so they had good examples on both sides. And so they created the culture that they wanted for their family.
Do you think that that has made you more resilient to change? Like you changed careers, pretty dramatically. Do you feel like you had kind of like the guts to do it, or the more so like the I can make a change if I want to because you kind of experienced change a lot as a child?
I think so. Yeah. I think something I didn't realize about moving around so much is I guess I mentioned this a little bit earlier about the kind of adapting, like being, I don't want to say uprooted because that sounds more dramatic than it was. We just moved a lot. And so being thrown into a new environment, new school, new friends, new language, new culture, new food, everything was so different, but it was just, this is just what you do. You like figure out how to make a friend with someone that doesn't speak your language, and now you're friends. And you go try the funky thing on a skewer at the bazaar in Istanbul, and you're like, you know what? That was nasty, but that's fine. I move on. It's just like trying new things and just going with the flow. I think part of my personality is it's sometimes too much go with the flow. I've learned that too, where I've learned when to pull out my type A and when to pull out my type B. Can depend on the situation.
I think it's cool that you put it that way because often, like, I know when I was growing up, it was very much like you are either type A or type B, or
Mm-hmm.
you're either go with the flow or uptight. And I have realized, just as you just said, like, it's like a growth mentality or a fixed, where like you're here or you're there.
Mm.
Have you always had that, like, where I can pull out type A or type B, or like, is that kind of more recent, like maybe with motherhood or something?
I think that's recent since marriage. It's amazing what happens once you get married is you see yourself from an outside perspective. Like you're all of a sudden you're with someone and you're like, what the heck are you doing? Why is that? But it's just it makes perfect sense to them because of their upbringing and then vice versa. And I remember I remember the moment where I realized, okay, I think I might be too much type B is actually when we were traveling when I was a teenager and my suitcase was really annoying me because one of the wheels, the rubber had come off halfway. And so it was really loud and kind of jiggly. And I remember going through the airport and the ground was really smooth, but the suitcase was sure not smooth. And I remember we got to our gate and my dad was like, what is up with your suitcase? And I remember thinking like, oh, it's fine. Like something's funky, but whatever. My dad's like, no, like, let's look at it. Like actually, let's see if we can solve the problem. And sure enough, it took 2 seconds to just rip off the rubber and it was fixed. And that was actually really pivotal for me because I remember thinking, okay, I can like spend 2 seconds to figure out what a problem is and fix it as opposed to being go with the flow to the point where I'm kind of just underlying a little bit annoyed by something, but I could easily fix it. And so that was a moment where I was like, okay, I can like step up my game a little bit in the type A category. And then I think especially since being married, having a new job and having a kid now, the type A can come out more. And I don't look at it as a bad thing. I look at it as like it's enhancing who I can be and what I can do.
Yeah, I love that. So you were in this, the new job you just mentioned, you're in the marketing world. And how long did you do that? Like, what was kind of the trajectory there in that world?
So I was in, let's see, I was probably learning for a few months, working for Katie part-time for a year. And then I worked with her for, I think it was about 2.5 years after that. And then that's when I had Charlotte. And so then I took a break after that. It didn't work. And then a few months after, I realized, okay, well, actually, I went back to work for a few months. I went back to work 2 weeks after having a kid, and that was a little fast looking back on it. But I think it was helpful in some ways and not helpful in others. Um, but so a few months after that, I ended things with Katie very amicably, and we're still friends. We just talked today even. And then then I took a break. I'm like, okay, cool. I'm like a mom now. I can just kind of not chill out because that's not who I am, but like I could just be a mom. And spent a lot of time with my passions. I love cooking and I was working out sort of, but there's a baby, so that was a little bit hard logistically. But then in the summer of last year is when I was like, okay, I think not only do I have the time now because she's napping consistently, but my family could use some more income and I want to work. I want to get back into doing something. And then I had to ask myself, like, how in the, like, what do I even do? Because I have this really weird set of skills and how do I want to apply that? And so that's kind of how I got to that point.
And so now you are working with Airbnb hosts and helping them like just focus on the tasks that expand their portfolio. So like tell us like a little bit about what that looks like for you.
Yeah, so what I do right now is I help Airbnb owners make more money, and it's really tailored to what each Airbnb owner needs. So one of my clients has two properties and they want to scale to 100. And so I'm helping them identify properties, make sure they're designed and furnished so they do well on the platform, and just helping them scale and optimize with their systems. And so that pulls in like my mapping and data analytics. It also pulls in my international experience with design, furnishing. Like there's a lot of not professional ability, but a lot of experience there. And then another one of my clients has a lot of properties and he was too involved in the day to day. And so I'm helping him create standard operating procedures, helping him hire out tasks so he can focus on what really matters. And ultimately, now what I do is I help Airbnb owners with marketing. So Airbnbs that have multiple properties in their portfolio, but they want to drive more direct bookings. They want to make higher nightly rates through off-platform marketing, because that's kind of where the market is shifting right now. Is there's a lot of competition, and I don't look at that as a roadblock. I look at that as an opportunity. And so, how do you differentiate yourself in the market, not only in your listing and in your property, but also in your off-platform marketing? So that's what I focus on now.
What a cool, like, full circle moment for you,
Yeah.
because you just mentioned like it's this, it's this, it's this, it's this. And I find that often with, this shows like the whole picture. It's called The Whole Picture. And we talk about
Yeah.
hobbies and passion projects and all that. But what I often find is like, we're not talking about business at all. We're talking about your life. But then because we're entrepreneurs, like it often ends up like right back. The end of the story is like, yeah, so I took all that and I do this now. Like, because that's just who we are inherently,
Yeah.
is like integrators kind of.
Yep.
Um, so does it feel like you found this thing that combines all your stuff and you're like running with it, like you're excited to be doing what you're doing every day?
Yeah, I am all in on this. It finally feels like all of the puzzle pieces of my life have come together because it has felt pretty disjointed. Not in a bad way, but just a lot of little pieces kind of floating around. Sometimes they would connect, sometimes they wouldn't. But now I feel like I can finally see what the puzzle pieces are, the image that they're forming, and it's really exciting.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I can tell that on you. We've known each other, we've bumped into each other like, over the years
Yeah.
in all these circles that we're in. And you have always like seemed so confident and sure in what you're doing and your, marketing, and you had some cooking stuff happening and all that. This feels like that, but like integrated more. Like it's like you have
Yes.
all that confidence that you had before and all the skill sets, because the confidence comes from your skill set, which you have used in all of your stuff. But this is like the passion behind it, I can see is like a lot has like solidified for you.
Yeah. And it's interesting you say confidence because for a while, and even sometimes now, I don't view myself as a super confident person, or in some areas of my life, I'm confident, in some areas, I'm not. And so, yeah, it's really interesting to hear you say that I'm like a confident person because sometimes that does not feel true. So, thank
Mhm.
you for saying
That's
that.
It's so interesting how we perceive
Yeah.
ourselves, and then because I've had people say stuff like that to me too, like, oh, you've seen this, and I'm like, I'm terrified, but cool, thanks for saying that. Like, so that's great. Yeah. Um, Okay, so as we're wrapping up, just a couple like rapid fire
Yeah.
cool questions. So obviously you have eaten all over the world. Tell us like your favorite cuisine, your favorite meal in your international travels.
Oh, man. This will literally change by the hour, but right now I am craving a Turkish guzleme that is by the Blue Mosque. There was this really old lady that would sit on this like near this hot plate and she would roll out phyllo dough and put feta and spinach in it and she would cook it and flip it. It was like this really big yummy pancake. So that would change probably 20 minutes from now, but that's what I want right now.
That sounds amazing. Um, Tell us your like go-to hack, like your low energy, you need to get something done. Like what's a go-to like hack to like get back up in the moment and like do the thing you need to do?
Jumping jacks. Whether I have no energy or too much energy, jumping jacks helps me like orient all of my energy.
Regulate. Yes, I love that.
Yep.
Okay. And last question, what are you currently reading something or listening to something that is resonating with you a lot?
I'm currently reading Pitch Anything, and I truly think it did like this will change my life. It already has, but I've never understood how people can show up confidently with integrity in negotiations. And this book explains how to do that. And it's just mind blowing.
Oh, cool. Okay, yes, I've heard this mentioned and I need to pick it up because I've heard a lot of people really like it. Very
Yeah, it's
cool.
amazing.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being with us. This was lovely. And we're going to point everyone to your socials if they can go follow along the journey and see all the cool stuff you're doing. So tell us your handle on Instagram and all that.
Perfect. So on Instagram, my social media handle is my first and last name, Andrea.Befus, Befus. And then you'll see my link to my Facebook profile on there as well.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks.